Welcome. We're delighted you're able to join us this morning for today's report launch. My name's Sophie and I'm Research and Projects Manager at Future of London. Today's discussion is the final event in our Rethinking Community Engagement programme and the launch of our report, Making the Most of Co-Production. This morning I'm going to be presenting our findings and discussing our co-production principles with our fantastic panel of speakers. But before we do that, I just quickly want to run through some housekeeping. So first of all, if you could rename yourselves with your full name and your organisation, this really helps us know who you are, and so we can send you any relevant follow-up emails about this event, about other similar events, including the link to the video of this, the report links and so on. Please get involved using the chat function this morning. Say hello, let us know your interest in the topic. And if you have any questions for the panel, pop them into the Q&A box. We do have quite a full agenda this morning, but if we have time, we'll try to answer some of your questions at the end. And our social media tag is #RethinkEngagement. Feel free to tag us at Future of LGN if you're writing about the event on social media. So on to today's event. Next slide, please. The aim of this programme, Rethinking Community Engagement, was to explore how built environment practitioners could engage with local communities in a more meaningful way. At our launch event in June 2022, lots of issues were raised that we could have explored in more detail, but in response to interest from our network and also to the resources that were already widely available, we decided to focus on co-production. Whilst co-production is relatively established in other disciplines, it's not that well understood in our sector. 52% of the audience who came to that launch didn't have a clear understanding of what co-production meant in the context of the built environment, and 99% thought that the sector could benefit from greater clarity and agreement on how to do it. Nevertheless, we're hearing terms like co-design and co-production being used more and more across the sector, so we wanted to find out how the reality was comparing to the rhetoric. Is this a genuine shift in approach, or is this co-washing, which is when professionals call an engagement process co-design or co-production, but then only inform or consult community members rather than devolving any actual decision-making power? Co-washing not only makes the terms co-design and co-production rather meaningless, but it also erodes trust in the built environment profession. And as we heard at our launch event last June, trust in the sector is low. In 2019, Grosvenor ran a survey into public trust in large-scale development and found that just 2% of the public trust developers and only 7% trust local authorities. So we also wanted to find out whether community groups and sector practitioners had similar or different experiences and understandings of co-production. To answer these questions, we ran several workshops with community representatives and built environment professionals from across the sector, exploring how co-production is currently happening in London. Next slide, please, Hannah. So we found that co-production is already happening as part of housing and regeneration projects across the capital. And we found that community members and professionals with some experience of it have similar understandings of how authentic co-production should happen in practice. So that was very positive. But we also found that co-washing is happening within the sector, and we have heard from some professionals who are working on projects and calling it co-production, but they know that what they're really doing is just consulting and collaborating with community members rather than sharing power with them. By exploring people's positive and negative experiences of co-production, or so-called co-production, we've created Future of London's co-production principles. Next slide, please. So these are the principles. We're proposing that for co-production to be genuine, there are 3 key principles that underpin the process: sharing power, sharing knowledge, and being inclusive. Trust will help to get these things right, and getting these things right will generate further trust. But, big question, how do you know if a process is getting these things right? So next slide, please. So accompanying each of our principles then are a series of questions to help with this. And on the slide are the questions for the sharing knowledge principle to give you a sense of what this looks like. The questions have been written so that everyone involved in a co-production process should be able to answer them. Ideally, everyone would answer yes to each of the questions, both at the start of the process and at various points throughout. But in reality, co-production is challenging and complex. And instead of expecting everyone to agree on all points, how people answer the questions will more likely show where there is consensus, so where lots of people answer yes, and where there is conflict, where lots of people answer no. This indicates where to focus your energy to improve the co-production process. Our co-production principles are designed to be flexible and non-specific. Our research has shown that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to co-production that could work for all stakeholders across all the different types and scales of development in London. These are guiding principles, and we expect people to adapt them for the particular needs of specific projects and specific contexts. Next slide, please. And we've designed the principles for everybody. Practitioners, consultants, and community representatives. And in a moment, we're going to hear reflections and responses to them from all of these perspectives. Our panel will share their thoughts on how they plan on using the principles. But in our report, we've also made some suggestions of how we see them being used in practice, such as using them to form the basis of your organisation's co-produced charter of co-production, or to hold the sector to account and challenge co-washing. The aim of the principles is to provide a shared understanding of what co-production means in the context of the built environment and to set the standard for what good looks like. Next slide, please. But as I've said, we recognise that in practice, co-production is challenging and complex, and there are significant barriers stopping it from becoming a more widespread practice. We explored these barriers at a half-day event last November. And what we learned is that, firstly, community members want to be involved in a co-production process before any decisions have been made. But often in the development process, there is no clear beginning. Similarly, in a process of urban change, so this is very difficult to do. Secondly, power sharing remains a big sticking point. Despite the fact that devolving decision-making is at the heart of co-production, our research has revealed that many in the sector, both practitioners and community representatives, remain quite cynical about the extent to which power really can be shared in the built environment. At the moment, professionals hold most of the decision-making power, including the power to initiate a co-production process. And although they might be willing to share power with community members in theory, in practice, this is far from straightforward. Community members in particular are concerned about accountability. The fact that there is inevitably a power imbalance may well mean that the community members don't have the power to hold the professionals involved in the process to account. And without accountability, there's a risk that a co-production process stops being co-production or feels imposed on communities. And finally, we also asked the question in the report, is co-production possible in a broken system? Siloed working, particularly in local authorities and housing associations, can undermine co-production. For it to be successful, there has to be organisational buy-in from top to bottom, and getting this may require widespread culture change for all of us. A co-production approach also requires more time and resources than traditional consultation, and this is a big barrier. Although we do make the point in our report that co-production can potentially save time and money further down the line if there are less objections to a scheme, for example, from the local community. Next slide, please. In order to overcome these challenges and make co-production more mainstream, our report makes a number of recommendations. Firstly, of course, use our co-production principles. We really want people to use them. We really want you to share them with colleagues and partners. We want you to test them out in real situations, and we want to hear from you. We want your feedback. Secondly, don't co-wash. Our report makes it clear that co-production isn't right for every project, and sometimes other engagement approaches will be more valid, but don't call it co-production if it's not. And if you can't do co-production, think about what elements you can take from our principles to enhance your current community engagement approach. And thirdly, there's a need to develop more easily accessible resources for communities and practitioners on co-production, as we've outlined on the slide. So that's a whistle-stop tour through our co-production principles and a summary of our report findings and our recommendations. But how are we going to put this into practice? To discuss this, we're going to hear from a wide range of practitioners and community representatives this morning. So we're delighted to be joined by Isabel Lamello, Senior Architectural and Urban Designer from Arup, Nkechea Kekearu, High Street Recovery Lead at the Royal Borough of Kingston, Mifamwe Taylor, a founding member of Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society, and Leva Hume, Early Career Research Fellow at the Bartlett School of Planning, Patrick Devlin, partner at Pollard Thomas Edwards, Miko Newman, Director of Newman Francis, Lewis Kinch, Co-Creation and Innovation Manager at Southern Housing, Chris Setz, Resident Workstream Member of the Broadwater Farm Improvement Programme, and Sandra Stancliffe, Head of Communities, Learning, Inclusion and Volunteering at Historic England. I won't go into details about everybody's background, but please take a look at their bios in your agenda, as they've all worked on really interesting projects and their social media handles are in there too. So without further ado, I'm going to go to Betty. So Betty, how do you envisage using the principles at Arup?
Thank you so much, Sophie, for the introduction and for a great presentation of the work you have done on the principles. So I think my view as a consultant is that these principles can be used as an excellent tool to guide us, being the consultant team, even from very early stages of a project, from the moment we are bidding to win new work, that we need to develop our methodologies that demonstrate that we are effectively engaging with communities and then we have a commitment to co-design. We could use these principles to define the outcomes that we would like to achieve towards the end of the process. So I think that, as we all know, co-production is not common practice. And when you talk about co-production with others involved in the development process, they will tell you it's too hard, it's almost impossible to achieve, it requires too much time, too much resources. So for us as consultants, it's very important that we develop methodologies that make it look like it's easier for everyone involved to co-produce. And with the principles, we are ensuring that these methodologies are actually delivering the right outcomes. For example, when we think about methodologies, we need to think about the outputs as well. And I'm going to link this back to one of the principles. We're saying that one of the key things is about sharing knowledge. So in these final outputs, the final reports, it needs to be not just about collating the learnings. These report on itself needs to be knowledge that is shared with the community so they can make their own decisions in the future, even when us as consultants are no longer involved. So I really think that these principles are a good step into defining what co-production should be and the way it should happen in the built environment. I do think that it's our responsibility, not just as consultants, but like everyone involved, to commit to these principles, adapt our approaches to and our ways of working to make the right design choices and make co-production happen in a meaningful and truthful way. So thank you again, Future of London, for the invitation, and I look forward to hearing from other speakers.
Well, thank you, Betty. That's great, and I completely agree about making it easy, and also about the fact that we kind of really need kind of sector-wide change in order for that to happen. So Nkechea, you work at the Royal Borough of Kingston. So how do you see the principles being used by a local authority?
So I think that in a local authority, we can lose in lots of different ways because it's such a big organisation. And I think the focus is usually on housing development. I think the principles and production of report have caused us to reflect on how we've been using co-production in our town centres and high streets. So I work in regeneration and growth, focusing on town centre, and in two particular town centres, we've been working in different ways with the community. So in New Malden, we've created a town centre partnership to deliver public realm transformation, support businesses and activate the town centre. And in Kingston Town Centre, we've created a citizens panel of about 40 members to develop a spatial plan and vision for the town centre. So we're still on a journey and we're still learning. And even within the same council, we've had different approaches. But the principles have sort of highlighted the different ways that we have been trying to apply the principles of power sharing and sharing knowledge and being inclusive. In New Malden, for example, the partnership is chaired by a local resident and made up of community and business reps. But we've worked with them from the beginning to develop a vision that's shared, develop in terms of reference, and deliver and design our town centre projects. And we also share responsibility and ownership for the maintenance and ongoing kind of viability of our project. So for example, we've delivered a temporary town square, and our partnership worked with us to do community gardening and cleaning and develop events on the square. And we've also been keen to ensure that the knowledge sharing is bottom up as well as top down. So we funded what we call a community connector, because our partnership are all volunteers. They can give extra capacity to our partnership to kind of facilitate that two-way flow of knowledge between the council and the local community, but also between the partnership and the wider community as well. And they've also developed their own social media channels. They have monthly meetings, and they've also taken the lead in kind of been awarded funds to deliver our town centre aims. So it really is a joint emphasis in terms of producing and owning all our projects in the town centre. In Kingston Town Centre, the citizens panel was kind of demographically representative, not only just kind of ethnicity and age, for example, but also tenure and housing and occupation. And so colleagues in kind of place shaping and communications have been working with this panel for the past year to really develop this vision and plan for the town centre. And it's given the panel members a sense of ownership in terms of the process. And they've also been remunerated, which is different from our New Malden panel. And so they've been ambassadors for this vision, and this co-produced kind of vision and plan is currently in consultation now. So in terms of how the Future of London kind of principles can be applied going forward, there's definitely a space in terms of the beginning of the project, but kind of reflecting on what we've done in Kingston. It's a really useful tool to shine a mirror on reflecting on progress and lessons learned with the local community, so that we can perhaps kind of scale up to different town centres or adapt our approach in partnership with the local community as well. I think there's just a few other things in terms of the local authority, because it does need dedicated council time to support our kind of communities. We try to build better relationships with the local community. So it's reinforced that the process is just as important as the end result. And the power dynamic is an interesting mix in a local authority, because we are political organisations. So that adds another layer to complexity. But we've made a conscious effort.
I'm going to stop you. Sorry, it's just so we've got lots of people to get through. But no, they're all really valid points. And I think that the point you made about bottom-up knowledge sharing is key. That came up at one of our events, and that knowledge sharing is not just about making, you know, the sector's knowledge more accessible, but it's also about that two-way process that you described. And also the fact that you said that those two different examples are different, and that, you know, that resonates with there's not one size fits all, and that each very particular place will have a different way of doing this. So thank you. We're going to move on to Ifanwe. So you have two hats on today. So as an academic working on these issues, but also as a founding member of Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society. So what are your thoughts on the principles?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie, and thanks to Future of London for the chance to comment on the principles. So yeah, as you mentioned, I do have two hats. I work as a researcher at Butler School of Planning, focusing on urban economic development, but especially collaborative and action-oriented research with market traders, industrial firms and small businesses who often find themselves sort of marginalised or displaced by urban development processes. But also where I live in Tottenham, I volunteer as a founding member of the Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society and a trustee of the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust as well. And we've been working there to advance the community plan for Ward's Corner and Seven Sisters Market, recently setting up this new community benefit society as a vehicle to restore and manage the building for the benefit of the community and traders once we've secured a long-term lease from Transport for London, hopefully towards the end of this year. So I really welcome this piece of work, the recommendations and the principles, and I think it's really encouraging to see so many people from the built environment sector here today. I believe that co-production is one of the routes through which existing local residents and businesses can benefit more from regeneration and redevelopment schemes, which too often do marginalise or displace them, especially in London, given the pressures of the property market. So really welcome Future of London's leadership in this area, and hope definitely that it will drive a reduction in co-washing, but also really increase meaningful co-production. And the aspect I think that I want to focus on today is the sharing of power, which I think is fundamental to all of this. And that is the first of the 3 co-production principles. So I think unless power is being shared, co-production isn't happening. This means sharing resources, knowledge, decisions, delivery and management with impacted communities. And really, as we can understand, this sort of radically reconfigures how we do urban redevelopment and who and what it's for. And this, of course, is one of the fundamental challenges, but also the opportunity that we have with co-production. So how might a community group such as the Wards Corner Community Benefit Society use these co-production principles? Well, firstly, I think they're incredibly useful, and groups can use them to help make the case for, to legitimize and to push for co-production where they believe that would help them meet their goals. And secondly, then to shape meaningful co-production processes. So to go beyond co-washing, to highlight weaknesses or gaps and to propose improvements to the process, which is obviously critical. So at Wards Corner, traders in the community have long been working towards achieving their own community plan, but we've recently secured major commitments from Transport for London and the Mayor of London to an initial closed bidding process for groups linked to traders only, and importantly, a social value lease. So this is a real opportunity. And I think the co-production principles are really useful here in demonstrating to Haringey Council, to Transport for London, to the Greater London Authority and the Mayor to show leadership, really the opportunity they have to show leadership on co-production at Wards Corner. And I think all parties can use the principles. So the way they've been written is that you can use them, you know, from whichever perspective you're coming from. So all parties at Wards Corner can use these co-production principles to reflect on where are we now? What gaps or problems do we have? And how can we together make changes to secure a meaningful and substantial collaboration and partnership that will deliver long-term benefits for traders and the community? So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. No, that's really, it's really great to hear that you see a real benefit for community groups as well. And I liked your emphasis on, you know, the positive benefits of doing co-production for everybody, because, you know, there clearly are positive benefits, and we don't just want this to be a kind of telling people off for co-washing or telling them to do something differently to how they're doing it, but we want people to see this as an opportunity, as you said. So, Patrick, what is the opportunity for PTE in terms of using the co-production principles from an architect's point of view?
Thank you, Sophie. Just echo what everybody else has said. I think this is a great piece of work, and it's tackled some issues head on. It's obviously the start, not the beginning of quite a long journey that many organisations need to go through. I've taken quite a literal interpretation of how we might use it. We have, broadly speaking, let's say, 2 or 3 kinds of clients who are interested in co-production. The most obvious one as a consultant is somebody who wants to develop something, right? And that is where the co-washing danger rears its head most strongly. But another is a client who may own land and genuinely wants to get input into what should happen with that land. And the third one is groups such as co-housing groups who want to co-produce things themselves. The question for all of them is, do you really want to do co-production? And this is the principles are really useful in addressing that conversation. And if you do, are you confident that you can do it on the scale of the project we're all looking at, or would it be sensible to road test how the principles might be applied somewhere else first? And is it the right thing to do in this place? That's really important. And part of that is, if you want to co-produce, who do you want to co-produce with? Who is the community? Who are the stakeholders? Right. So that's the first use of the principles for us, I think. And the second one is in having the same conversation with potential participants in the process. So that might be community groups, that might be utilities, that might be anybody who has an interest in that place and in making the place. The third obvious use for us is in helping to agree the process. So we've got these quite powerful tests. Does it share power? Does it share knowledge? Is it inclusive? All of which have a lot of conversation about them. And for each process, the only people who can judge that are the people who are part of the process, I think. So everybody has to sign up to that and say, for this thing that's been set up, for these parameters, which need to be agreed as part of the process, yes, it does do it. And agreeing the parameters is the crucial bit of this stage. What are we co-producing? Is it an entire town centre? Is it a street? Is it a management plan? Is it, might be all sorts of things, but that has to be agreed at the beginning, and the objective of what success looks like has to be agreed at the beginning. Otherwise, it's going to drift and we can't check it. And that brings me on to the fourth use for me of the principles, which is checking that the process remains a co-production process as it carries on. So all the participants have the opportunity to raise their hand at any point and say, but this isn't sharing power, this is not inclusive, it's not sharing knowledge. And then that's got to be addressed by the whole group, and it's got to move forward by group consensus. And each process has to decide for itself how to manage that. It sounds impossible. Our experience suggests actually, if you've been clear about what the objectives are, what the parameters are, it's easier than it sounds. People become engaged in making the project work, as well as bringing their own interests to the table. So those are my four.
Okay, no, thank you. And I think that point about making sure that it remains co-production is key. Because everybody at the event, all of you know, these processes last for a really long time. Housing projects, regeneration projects, it's years and years and years, and people will change both from the sector side, but also from the community side. So there needs to be kind of constant checking in that it is still co-production and it has remained kind of true to what was established at the beginning of the process. So thank you. Mikor, you have a lot of experience in community engagement, so it would be great to hear your point of view on the principles and how you as a consultant anticipate using them.
Thank you, Sophie. Echo everyone, really good piece of work. Really enjoyed being part of the event in November. In terms of the report, I think it's really useful to help us have that real conversation about effective community engagement. So that's really been useful. In terms of the principles, what I found is a really good starter for conversation with clients about community engagement, especially when they're talking about real co-production, and using those principles to help get buy-in from clients in terms of what needs to be in place. In terms of the principles, since November, I've re-looked at our 3 key co-production projects that we're working on, looking at the report to see what's missing around our co-production approach, and then looking at how we use those principles to identify the gaps. We're doing some good work with Haringey, and that approach has enabled us to have debriefs and look at where there are gaps, etc., enabled to actually help us strengthen the process. Co-washing for me is a big issue. It's an easy thing to slip into, and I think there's nothing wrong with looking at different methods of engagement, such as information consultation, etc. But it's about being very clear: is it co-production or is it not? So we don't undermine the importance of co-production. In terms of the principles, I think one of the areas that I think is quite sensitive is the whole issue about sharing power. And I think on projects, sometimes we think, just having residents in majority is going to be the enabler to enable that to be dealt with. But there are other issues. And I've been looking at things like, how do we capacity build? What information do we need? How do we support residents to really understand options and solutions so they feel that they're at the that they're at the table with the technical experts, etc. And where do we, how can we signpost residents, especially residents that don't have independent advisors or independent support, to good practice of voluntary sector advocacies, etc. And where possible, how can we enable resources for residents to get that technical support so they can get a second opinion to various issues? The area about being inclusive has been very, very useful. I think in terms of the process that we're using in a couple of our projects, it's really useful to use that checklist to go through our sessions and review our sessions to before they start and say, are they going to be inclusive? Are they going to enable residents to be effective? And if they're not, you know, what do we need to put in place to actually make that happen? And then lastly, in terms of the recommendations, testing the principles, I like that recommendation, and I really do think it's really useful to keep the momentum. You've got the report, you've created an infrastructure of practitioners being involved in that, and it'd be really useful for us to start looking at how we can start looking at creating best practice projects, so looking at our own existing projects, looking at some of the issues and problems and barriers and how we overcome them and share them, etc. So that's my feedback.
Oh, well, thank you. And yes, I really echo that. We really want people to go out and use them. At the moment, it's just a document, but we see it as being a kind of live document that will change over time as co-production happens more and people do test them out. So yes, take that advice, that's great. So Lewis, we have heard from Nkechi on how a local authority could use the principles, but what about a housing association and using them with your residents?
Great, thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so we've Southern Housing been attempting co-creation with varying levels of success for the last 3 years now, and I think the learning that I've taken from that is the residents are really keen for this. You know, they're super keen to be on board. For example, we put out some workshops recently. We had 240 slots filled up within a day. You know, that's how keen we are. We're getting from the residents. The difficulty for us is really selling this to our senior decision makers, and that's not to say that they're all like this. I've had some fantastic project sponsors that I've worked with. Our chief exec, for example, Paul Hackett's been amazing in being a cheerleader for co-production, but there's always going to be some skeptics, and I think the principles and this report really legitimizes co-production for me. And this is something that, you know, with names like Future London and the partners and the project sponsors you've got on there, this is something that I can use to say, look, this is you know, a real way of doing things, and it's legitimate and credible. And I think, again, you know, like some of the other panelists have touched on, co-washing is real. You know, we see it, and again, I think by highlighting that, this actually helps us address that and say, look, you know, we want to do this properly, and it's really beneficial to do it that way. I think the sharing power principle is, again, the most important for us, and it is the most difficult. It's probably only one of those three that we don't have complete control over. So we can be inclusive, we can share knowledge, but decision makers are used to making decisions, and you know, that is a difficulty when it comes to sharing those. So again, this really helps in bringing those decision makers along the journey with us. You know, using this report to help bring them on that along with the project. And I think finally as well, using this with my team, you know, we always want to learn, and actually, like, you know, we can't become complacent with what we do. And I think, you know, this has been great for discussing with my team about how we can all improve, and actually we can, you know, keep pushing co-production within the work we do. So yeah, I think it's a really fantastic report, really pleased to see it, and I think it's going to be really useful for us with the work we do in social housing.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And Chris, then we'll hear from another community representative. So what value are the principles to residents involved in housing projects, for example, your resident steering group?
Okay, well, excuse me. The first thing I'd say is that I think this is a key lesson for me, is that mine are unusual and unrepresentative views. I can't speak for the community, and I don't think many people can, because the community have a huge range of views, and they always will. And I think speaking for the group, where government often say they want to hear just one voice, I think it has so many pitfalls it should be avoided. I'm really pleased to be here because I can be a critic, a harsh critic of the government, of local authorities, of the GLA, of councillors and of officers. But here, there's a group of people embarked on a project which I completely endorse. I think that methodologies for communities like mine are really helpful in being able to cover all the bases, in being able to tick all the boxes which, as we've heard here, sometimes haven't occurred to people to consider as an important balance in the assessment and the control of projects. As people have said, and I agree with all the speakers and endorse them, the principles are split into three significant aspects, and those aspects are, to me, just about right. And I can see, if you like, a spin on these. I'm old enough, I was 16 in May 68, when the students and the trades unions tried to get together, particularly in France, to stick it to the man and reinvent the world. And one of the things they wanted to do as students was to rewrite the syllabus. And I feel this is a similar activity in that what we're looking at, because of the tragedy of Grenfell, is a real need, as we all know well, for an increase in professionalism across the board. I mean, the government, as we know recently, have said that social housing managers are going to have to undertake specific training. And I spent a lot of time in my own industry looking at how you can move an industry to a profession. I'm delighted that things like this set of principles do help to professionalize all of our approaches. And I'd add one more thing, which I think we're seeing through the emergence of building safety and fire safety regulations. And it's the thing that I'm most concerned about when it comes to the people involved, residents, ordinary people. And that is that we as people do have to begin to accept a lot more responsibility for what is happening. So in our principles, we've got an approach and a methodology, and we talk about accountability, but it tends to be from the point of view of the resident being able to hold power to account. But we ourselves as residents really do need to accept some of the responsibilities for the outcomes. In other words, I think sharing power is a two-edged sword. And as officers become more professional, residents need to accept more responsibility for the outcomes. In terms of sharing knowledge, another core
I'm going to stop you there, I'm afraid, just so we can move on. But thank you. I really love your call to rewrite the syllabus. I think that's great. And yes, I think that sharing power will potentially change the dynamic. And what does that mean in terms of the responsibilities that communities can and should and aren't able to take on? It's a big question. So last but not least, Sandra, how might co-production and how might our principles shape Historic England's future work on community engagement?
Thank you, Sophie. So I thought it might be useful for me to articulate just before I start what Historic England is, because not everyone knows. Historic England is a government agency. We're funded by government in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And we describe ourselves as the public body that helps people care for, enjoy and celebrate England's spectacular historic environment. So that's who we are. We have been doing a year or more's investigation into kind of key bits of our strategic approach. And one of the things that we have decided that we're going to focus on is we've called it active participation. It's about handing power to people and helping people become more active in looking after our heritage. We are going to focus on what we've called connected communities, which is about bringing people together, using heritage and empowering people to have an active role to play. Those are just words because we need words as a way of organising our thoughts and ways of thinking. In terms of practice, the principles that you have created have come at a really, really helpful time for us, because we've been doing this rethinking about the way that we are organising our work. We're also now turning that into what that means practically. So we are going to be able to use the principles to inform our own work. So the way that we directly work with people when we are determining, for example, what's important in the heritage of a place, what heritage is significant, and how we understand the historic places that we're working in. It's really important that communities are involved in that process. And so the principles provide a framework for those kind of conversations. As well as our own work, a key part of our role is advice to local authorities, and we can make sure that we are echoing the principles of co-production in what we are advising local authorities to do. We don't really do that at the moment. We give lots of advice to local authorities, but we don't really advise them that we think that they should be talking to communities. I think we tend to leave that to local authorities, but there's power in us amplifying what the principles of co-production are in our messaging to local authorities. And I would also say that goes for our policy advice to government too. Very important role in advising government on how to best protect heritage and include heritage in decisions that are made about the development of places. But of course, we can amplify the principles in the advice that we give to governments too. However, one of the most important things that I think we can do, and the principles have really galvanized me to think about this in a way that I wasn't before, which is about the advice we give to communities. So we give a lot of advice to communities all over our website. There's stacks of advice and guidance. We're going to have before anyone looks for it, we're going to have a piece of work, the strand of work this year, which is about bringing all of that together into a community advice hub. It's all over the place at the moment. It's embedded with advice to local authorities. And if you're a community organisation, you'd be hard pressed to find it, but we will make it findable. But we can embed the principles in the advice we're giving to communities, because there's a real power in communities understanding that this is the kind of voice that they should be asking for. I was so interested to hear what Chris was saying.
Wrap up, Sandra, sorry.
That's fine. No, absolutely fine. I just wanted to kind of play credence to what Chris was saying, because actually that power is one of the most important things that we can do, and shift the power to communities.
Thank you. I'm sorry to all of you for interrupting. I could have asked you all to go into a lot more detail this morning, but because we wanted to inspire our audience, which is very broad and cross-sector, to go out and use the principles in a range of different ways, what we wanted to do this morning was hear a breadth of perspectives from across the sector, and I think we really have done that. So thank you all of you for your contributions and your reflections. We have a couple of minutes for questions. So I have a question I think we'll go for Lewis and Nkechi first of all, about how you have got buy-in from your senior leaders to do your co-production work. Maybe Lewis, we'll start with you. So co-creation is in your job title, but how have you managed to persuade your managers, your leaders, that this is worthwhile?
So we did do some sessions. We ran some kind of like education sessions with all staff, including senior staff, which were somewhat successful. But I've found that the best way to get decision makers on board is through demonstrating the value through projects you run. So we focus on our quick wins first. The people that already bought into it, we ran projects with them, and we then demonstrated the success of those, and then that brings other people on board. And I think we can talk about the theory and the morality and the ethics of doing co-production, but when a decision maker has to make a financial or a business decision, that doesn't sell it to them sometimes. But actually showing the benefit, showing the kind of the success in terms of the residents' satisfaction levels and perhaps efficiencies that you've created out of projects, that really sells it to people, and then you get more buy-in in the future, and then it starts to spiral and snowball, and you kind of get more stuff coming in, and you've got more to demonstrate.
And has that been your experience as well? Nkechi, sorry, at Kingston. Oh, I think you're on mute. Sorry, we'll just unmute you.
Yeah, I'd agree with Lewis. I think it's important to demonstrate the benefits of co-production. But I think I was lucky. By the time I joined Kingston, there was already a kind of political will and corporate will to commit to a co-production process across the whole council. And in New Milton particularly, we won some funding from the High Streets for All mission, which helped to kind of deliver some of our aims in terms of working with the community to co-produce the town centre as well. So having the resources helps as well.
Okay. And we have made that point in our report that we do need more kind of evidence and case studies about what the benefits are, as you said, Lewis, because that helps to make the case for more resources rather than just simply saying that it costs more money and takes more time. I have a question about co-washing, co-production and co-design. So the fact that it can be quite problematic when participants and the community aren't being paid or reimbursed for their time and expertise and knowledge. So do any of you have any thoughts about how you could talk to clients or colleagues about this in particularly in relation to the barriers people face in getting involved? So what people think about, and there's been a couple of questions in the chat about people giving up their time and the fact that volunteers give up a lot of time. So how can we make sure we avoid co-washing and kind of properly acknowledge the efforts people are making? I don't know if Mfanwe, you want to answer that, and then Patrick.
So avoiding co-washing is a big one. You slipped that in at the end, didn't you? On compensating people for their time. We've had interesting experiences in Redbridge with people being given vouchers, which is nice. What really worked brilliantly for youth co-design processes was to give people certificates as well as vouchers, but certificates that recognised the educational value of what they've been doing. You know, and it would be great to think about how that develops for people more widely, that it gives people not just some money. I think the resources need to be spread more equally in a process like this, as many of us have discussed, but also recognition of the knowledge and experience that comes in participating in a process, however that might take place.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. And Mfanwe.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, this is obviously a key question. So I think, I mean, the Future of London Principles obviously, you know, set, you know, the starting point for this. Clearly, I think everybody needs to sort of hold themselves and each other to account, I think, to just not use the word co-production if you can't do co-production. I think everybody should be able to sign up to that. That's quite straightforward, and that would be a real improvement. In terms of actually then trying to do co-production, I mean, again, it comes down to the sharing of power and the unequal resources available to resource co-production, I think, is key. So you know, there are loads of different approaches here. In some cases, it may be a question of paying for time. In other cases, there may be other barriers that need to be addressed. So it may be the time that meetings are taking place. It may be equipment that's needed. It may be childcare. It also may be, I think someone mentioned the idea of a sort of community-based worker, a paid worker that exists to support the unpaid community members. So I think there's loads of options here. I do think as well, though, we should avoid individualizing this too much, because communities can be developers themselves. They can form organizations and go through all the same professional process as any other developer, just with social aims and with the benefit of locally rooted knowledge. So I think, as well as thinking about how to enable and resource individuals to participate in co-production processes, local authorities in particular can be thinking about how to leverage their kind of VCS services and business development services to really support and enable strong community-rooted development organizations to flourish. So that's perhaps a longer-term capacity building, collaborative ethos that I think I would encourage exploring, as well as individually oriented measures.
Okay, and does anyone else have, Lewis, you'd like to jump in there as well?
Thanks. So we do financially incentivize a lot of our co-creation activities. Now, when we've just had our incentives policy signed off by board, And the reason we do this is because we've looked at what incentivizes people to take part, and sometimes that is that they will get something out of it at the end, they'll get a co-produced service, but sometimes we're taking people's lived experience and they might not actually benefit from the long-term change in the service, so they may not actually see a direct benefit during the co-creation process. And I think the reason I'm really keen on it is because when we talk about sharing power, if we're sat in a room and we've got some paid professionals sat in there, you've created a power hierarchy already, and actually you know, incentivizing someone, or you know, reimbursing their time to be there and saying your time is equally as valuable as my time is, and your knowledge is equally as valuable as my knowledge, means that we kind of have to level out the financial incentive as well.
But maybe that needs to be, how those incentives are done needs to be co-produced as well. Sandra, I can see you have your hand up. I think you are.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Lewis has just said, really. I think that the imbalance of power is really significant, and it comes down to a question of inclusion. And so inclusion is mentioned in the principles, of course it is, but you need to go through a process in this. There's almost like a step before, which is identifying the barriers to participation. What is it that is going to prevent people who live in that community from being involved? It might be financial incentives. That's a slightly separate issue. It might be time. It might be childcare or other caring responsibilities. It might be education. It might be assumptions around what is at stake and who, and the validity of the decisions. You have to address those barriers directly, one by one, and then you have to level the playing field in terms of the financial aspect of it and paying people for their time. But there are other barriers beyond the financial that are reasons that people won't get involved, and they need to be addressed directly first, and you need to go through a process of articulating those barriers and understanding them, and of course that needs to be done with the community.
Yeah, and although we've kind of regularly said that sharing power is the kind of thorniest, actually the question about being inclusive is huge, really important, and as we make this point in the report, it applies to all forms of engagement, not just co-production. But Miko, I can see you have your hand up as well.
Yes, it was just to echo a bit what Sandra was saying, just in terms of some of the incentives. I mean, Haringey provides some great incentives for residents being involved in terms of, you know, their time will be turned into opportunities to go on events or get services, etc. But we've also had situations in which where Newman Francis have had to train and employ residents to be part of the processes, to be part of facilitators, and that's made a really, really good big difference. And another situation is whereby we've actually enabled residents to get a technical budget, so they've been given money to use to pay them to check or get different kind of advice, etc., or to challenge. So coming back to really looking at the barriers and identifying what do you need to put in place to mitigate those barriers. I'd also say the work that we did at Grenfell, for instance, residents didn't want to be paid, and it was something they did want to do. They didn't think that was right. So I think it's really looking at the barriers first and seeing what makes sense to put in place.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Rosie Akram about working with the private sector, and is there a way we can encourage the private sector to buy into these principles and this process? I don't know if anyone has if anyone wants to kind of kick off on that, but I think I'd also say that we see this as a kind of sector-wide effort, so it's really about working with partners. It's not just an issue in one bit of the sector and not in others. But does anyone have any experience of working with private sector partners and being able to persuade them to do co-production? It's not looking very positive, is it? Betty, perhaps we could come to you. I'm going to put you on the spot. But as a consultant, when you're talking about bidding for work, then, as you did at the beginning of our discussion, do you think working with private sector partners that you may need to position this in a particular way compared to others?
Yeah, I do think that, I mean, of course, it depends on the private sector partner, but it's becoming common for local authorities and the public sector to demand for social value creation and strategies, plans, and designs that are truly community-led. I don't think it's the same way for the private sector. At least I haven't heard of that many case studies. I think it's been raised a couple of times in this session. For us, it's really important, if we really believe in this, to articulate the value through measures, because community engagement and co-production can be seen from different perspectives, like mitigating risks, for example, for a private developer. So I think it's about translating this value in a way that it resonates for them, to get them involved, and ultimately just deliver the community engagement and co-production.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think that's great. And I think that, yes, knowing the value in those who have done experience to who have experience of it and have done co-production, to be more demanding about doing it more. And we do make this point in the report as well, to think about other agendas that you can perhaps look at co-production through that lens, such as the ESG or the social value lenses. And social value is our big theme for the knowledge team at Future of London this year, just to make a plug for a future programme. So we're going to have to wrap up now. I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking our fantastic speakers for their time today. It's been really insightful to hear all of your thoughts and reflections on our report, so thank you all very much. Please download the report, Making the Case for Co-Production. We will send you a link afterwards, but I think there's also a link in the chat, and our summary insights, which includes a short version of the co-production principles as well. My thanks again to the speakers, and also to the FOL team behind the scenes, so Anna and Hannah, and also to our project sponsors, Arup, Countryside, Historic England, Mount Anvil, and Paula Thomas Edwards, who have made this programme possible. There are a huge number of acknowledgements in the report itself, as lots of people shared their insight with us and got involved in Rethinking Community Engagement last year. But particular thanks to Rowan Mackay and Sib Trigg from Community-Led Housing London, and Richard Lee from Just Space, and Stephen Hill from C20 Future Planners. So we're very grateful for all your help and support with this programme. And there's been lots of lively discussion in the chat this morning, so thank you all for that. It sounds like there are lots of organisations thinking about this and kind of incorporating it into their own policies and thinking. So we'd be really interested in hearing from you. We are keen, as I said, to get feedback and to continue this work, to make the case for co-production and see it become a more widespread practice. So do get in touch with us if you're interested in that. So with that, it's time to bring the session to a close. The video of this event will be up on our YouTube channel soon. And please do join our mailing list and fill in our feedback form. I think there are links in the chat, as it will help us improve our events in future. So from everyone at Future of London, thank you and goodbye.